Support for Central Florida Public Media comes from the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research, presenting Parkinson's IQ Plus You, Saturday, March 15th and open to the public. This event offers those living with Parkinson's and their loved ones a day of educational programming and connection with local community. Registration and more at michaeljfox.org/PDIQ Orlando.
You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. The Elon Musk-led Department of Government Efficiency has been attempting to audit federal agencies while firing tens of thousands of government employees. We'll hear from two Central Floridians experiencing the uncertainty brought on by DOGE activity. But first, elected leaders in the Florida House and Senate are now meeting in Tallahassee as part of their 60-day regular session that kicked off this week. We have a team of our Central Florida Public Media reporters joining us in studio today. They're following developments from the Florida legislature that may impact life for Central Floridians. Environment reporter Molly Durg is here. Joe Burns follows issues involving our aging population. Lillian Hernandez-Caraballo covers housing and homelessness and is a Report for America Corps member. And Rick Brunson is focusing on immigration. Rick, we'll start with you because lawmakers already had 3 special sessions on immigration before this regular session even started this week. E-Verify. That is a federal internet-based program. It allows employers to check whether an employee is authorized to legally work in the U.S. Florida lawmakers are considering a bill to expand it. So, Rick, how would this change the existing E-Verify policies?
So the E-Verify law that passed 2 years ago in 2023 exempted companies with fewer than 25 employees. This bill would cover all companies, regardless of size. It would also add stiffer enforcement penalties, imposing fines of between $10,000 to $500,000 for noncompliance and suspension of a company's business license.
Okay, I do think it is important here to note this bill does have bipartisan support. It's co-sponsored by a Republican with vocal support from Governor DeSantis. And Democrat Jason Pizzo, a sponsor of the E-Verify bill, spoke about this legislation.
And while many have talked tough on combating illegal immigration, here we are in 2025. And I, the Democratic minority leader, was the first to file the bill requiring E-Verify for all employers. Because you are not serious about curbing illegal immigration if you continue to cower to donors and not listen to our citizens.
So, Rick, what have you learned about how this would impact businesses?
An expansion of E-Verify under this proposed legislation would impact every private business in Florida, regardless of size. In doing a bit of research, I came across data from the Federal Small Business Administration's 2024 Small Business Profile for Florida. And it highlights that there are 3.3 million small businesses in Florida. And of those, about 500,000 employ up to 19 employees. So a lot.
Yeah, this has potential to have a large impact here. And I'm curious, did you find there are industries where a lot of these small businesses are focused, Rick?
Yeah, so a lot of them are concentrated in construction and healthcare and retail. And there's also a large segment of these businesses in agriculture.
Okay, and there are competing versions of this bill. Can you help us understand how they differ?
Yeah, so Republican Representative Bernie Jacques over in Seminole, over in the Gulf Coast, has proposed an E-Verify expansion bill, but it doesn't really have any enforcement provisions. What's different about the Democratic version of this bill is that it would really stiffen enforcement for businesses that don't comply. Those fines in the tens of thousands of dollars that I mentioned and suspensions of the company's business licenses, which would make it impossible for them to do business in Florida. If you lose your license, you can't do business here. The bills are now under consideration in committees in both houses of the legislature, and the enforcement provisions are where I think the debate is going to get really interesting on this, because the enforcement of the 2023 law has been widely viewed as uneven to non-existent.
So I would imagine this legislation has some people concerned. What are you hearing from immigration advocates?
Yeah, so an immigration attorney told me that they thought enforcement would still be an issue because the state doesn't have the infrastructure or the human resources to enforce compliance. And immigration advocates have told me that this would only exacerbate the labor shortage that's critical already in key industries such as construction and agriculture. I spoke to a manager of a small local roofing company here in Central Florida. And he told me that after the 2023 law went into effect, he scrambled to make sure all of his workers were authorized to work in the U.S. He said the process was a hassle, and there was a lot of paperwork involved. And he did lose some of his workers who left to go work elsewhere in other states. But now, 2 years later, with this new proposed expansion of the law, he's not as worried because all of his employees are good to go.
And actually, speaking of growers, Lily, I want to bring you into the conversation now. A bill was filed related to housing for legally verified agricultural workers. What's the purpose of this bill, Lily?
Well, if this bill passes, it will make it easier for farm owners to build housing for their migrant workers.
How so?
Well, it's actually commonplace for farmers to provide workers with housing. Farms are usually in remote locations, and the labor is usually done by immigrants who often need homes while they're here. But to build these homes, farmers require approval from municipalities. They have to clear any local zoning and development restrictions, and the rest of its residents. They need that support. The bill cites Florida's need because there's actually a shortage of farm workers right now. So this bill would preempt local governments from placing any kind of hurdles on development. It actually also offers protections, saying that existing worker housing going unused or not meeting the health and quality standards must be removed.
All right. Thank you, Lily.
Yeah, no problem.
Let's move on now from agriculture to the environment. People probably remember that uproar last year after a plan called the Great Outdoors Initiative that would have added pickleball courts, golf, and lodging to state parks. We saw that it prompted protests and criticism from everyone. It was the public, lawmakers, advocacy groups like the Nature Conservancy. That's here in Florida. And here's the executive director, Greg Connect, speaking about that controversial plan last year.
I don't think that the vast majority of taxpayers expect that their state parks, again, are going to become places with, large lodges that weren't already existing, pickleball courts. But I think for all of those kinds of activities, I don't think the vast majority of the public, when they think about our award-winning state parks, think about that kind of infrastructure.
Following backlash to that plan, lawmakers have now put forth a bill being considered in this session, the State Land Management Bill. Now, it doesn't explicitly ban development in state parks, so what does it do, Molly?
Yeah, this bill would more tightly define kind of the purpose of state parks, and also would more tightly define the public notification requirements for any time changes are made to a state parks management plan. Right now, those public notice requirements only apply to state parks of a certain size of 160 acres or more, but this proposed legislation would apply those requirements to all state parks. So what this bill would do, it would prevent building golf courses, pickleball courts, and hotel-style lodges in state parks. Those were, some of the things that spurred the most controversy in the uncovered plans last year. It would allow, though, the bill would allow for cabins with a maximum capacity of 6 people to be built in state parks. So as you said, it does not completely ban development.
So, Molly, what do you think we should understand about the impact of this issue here in Central Florida?
Right. So initially last year, when this Great Outdoors Initiative came to light, the very first plans that were uncovered addressed plans for development at 9 different state parks, and none of those were right here in Central Florida. Of course, we know we do have state parks, many beloved state parks here in Central Florida. A little bit later, though, there were more plans later unveiled that showed plans to develop in 3 Central Florida parks. And those were Lake Louisa State Park in Lake County, Silver Springs State Park in Marion County, and North Peninsula State Park in Volusia County. So this would have had an impact here in Central Florida. And as we know, we love our state parks here. So
absolutely. Last but not least, Joe Burns, the original plan was for you to tell us about some of the key bills filed by our Central Florida lawmakers. However, you found there are more than 400 bills and resolutions. Obviously, we can't go through all of them here, but I do appreciate that you did. And I want to talk to you about one that stood out to you involving diverting defendants to mental health treatment resources. What does this bill do, Joe?
So basically, it aims to divert nonviolent defendants with mental illness to treatment instead of sending them to jail and prison. It creates a model process for pretrial mental health diversion that requires treatment. It also provides for grants to support these programs along with specialized training for 911 operators. And if a defendant who was deemed incompetent to stand trial, so he couldn't stand trial, he wasn't competent to stand trial, regains competence. So if the judge sentences that person, any probation has to include treatment. They can't just dump them on the street.
And Joe, when you and I were talking, it sounds like this is a real statewide effort. The House version was filed by a Central Florida lawmaker. The Senate version is being called the Tristan Murphy Act. Joe, tell us, who was Murphy and how did he inspire this bill?
Oh, it's a really, really sad story. He was a 37-year-old father who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, had other mental health issues, and had previously attempted suicide. In 2021, he was sent to prison west of Miami on a felony littering charge. Murphy, who was reportedly not receiving his medications, he committed suicide while he was in prison.
Gosh. Well, Joe, already this bill has been in a committee hearing this quick, right?
That's right. So at that hearing, Murphy's mother, Cindy Murphy, said he clearly should have been diverted out of the criminal justice system, and there's universal agreement on that, and should be alive today if the provisions and options available in this bill that's named after him had been available at that time.
I am really so thankful and grateful that you all have recognized Tristan in this way. To me, it's a big apology that things should have been different, things should have been better. And I accept that apology and really am excited that this move forward. My whole goal since this happened to Tristan has been to make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone else, that no one else's family has to go through this, that people get the treatment that they need, that they get diverted early on.
Joe, this is another bill that appears to have bipartisan support. Are there voices of opposition to this?
Not really. The Tristan Murphy Act sailed through the Criminal Justice Committee with unanimous bipartisan support. The Florida Sheriff's Association backs it, and so do groups that support people with mental illness. It also has the endorsement of Senate President Ben Albritton.
All right, thank you all for your work in following all these bills. Before I let you go and we wrap up, let's lighten the mood a bit. Have a little fun, quick rapid fire around here. I want to ask each of you to briefly tell us about a bill that you are keeping an eye on that could impact us in Central Florida. Lily, why don't you start us off?
I won't lie. I'm not sure if these bills are going to pass. The bill that I was keeping an eye on, however, is because the Democrats in this legislative session are pushing for things that they've been sounding the drum about for years. And they're bringing back up tenant protections. With this, I'm interested to see if the modifications they've made this time to the bills they're offering the Republican majority of lawmakers in the state, if the changes that they've made, any modifications to the bills will actually resonate with the Republicans and how that will go. So they're just pushing for those tenant protections again, basically trying to keep landlords from being able to evict people so easily, just setting parameters for landlords and tenants at the same time. So I'm excited about those.
All right, we'll see what happens there. Yeah. Molly, what's a bill that you're eyeing this session?
I'm looking at a bill called Release of Conservation Easements. This is, so just to quickly define conservation easements, these are voluntary legal agreements between a landowner and some other entity, maybe a non-governmental organization, or sometimes a public agency, perhaps an agency of the state, a water management district. And basically, conservation easements restrict how a piece of land can be used in the interest of protecting natural resources. They're generally seen as permanent binding agreements. Well, this proposed bill I'm keeping an eye on that lawmakers are considering would require water management districts to release landowners from conservation easement agreements under certain conditions if the landowner requests it. There are many, landowners with conservation easements. The University of Central Florida is just one example. 319 acres of conservation easements protected by the St. Johns River Water Management District. That's just one example. There are private landowners as well, but basically this bill would set the terms and allow for a landowner to request, hey, I don't want this.
All right. Joe Burns, how about you?
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with something called the nanny cam. That's when you are leaving the house and you have a babysitter there. You have a little camera, keeps track of how your kids are doing, how the babysitter's treating them, right? Essentially, there's a bill that would create that for nursing homes, where a person in a bed there could request to have a camera monitoring them, or the person in their family who has responsibility for them has a camera monitoring them. It's called like a digital monitoring of the person in the bed. It can make a big difference in terms of preventing a mistreatment of people in nursing homes. This bill, there was an earlier version of it, previous years. There were privacy concerns because you don't want the person being spied on. Well, in this case, the person who's a patient or the person who has power of attorney for that person has to request the monitoring.
Okay, so that would address those privacy concerns, presumably.
Exactly.
Okay. And let's bring it full circle now and end where we started with you, Rick.
So there's a bill called the Forms of Identification Bill that would expand the list of acceptable forms of identification for voter registration. But what's interesting about it is that it would also require that driver's licenses issued to drivers denote that certain individuals are non-citizens. So whether you are a citizen or not may end up being on your driver's license, which is intriguing.
Yeah, certainly has potential to have a widespread impact there. Thank you to all of you, Central Florida Public Media reporters Rick Brunson, Joe Burns, Lillian Hernandez Caraballo, and Molly Durig. They and the rest of the Central Florida Public Media newsroom will be following developments throughout this session. You can find updates online anytime at cfpublic.org. And we want to engage with you. What would you like to see your lawmakers address in this session? What policy proposals have you concerned? Which ones will directly impact your lives? Reach out to us. Let us know. Send us an email to engage@cfpublic.org, or you can send us a talkback on the free Central Florida Public Media app. The impacts of federal job cuts are being felt in our Central Florida communities. Even with the uncertainty over whether the firings are legal, people are losing their jobs by the thousands under the Trump administration and Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. About 80% of the federal civilian workforce is outside of Washington, D.C. They're workers like Doug Jackson, a U.S. Marine veteran of the Iraq War living in Orlando. He applied to work at the IRS in May of last year. After successfully going through months of onboarding and completing the hiring process, he was just 5 weeks into his public affairs job at the IRS when he was fired at the end of February. Jackson was technically a probationary employee because he had transferred to a new agency in a new position. But before his time at the IRS, he already had more than 3 years of experience as a federal contractor. Prior to that, he worked for NASA for 4 years. Doug Jackson joined us in studio to talk about the misconceptions he thinks people have about probationary federal employees losing their jobs right now. He began his story by describing the day he learned he would be fired from his job with the IRS.
This was on a Friday, the day prior. Someone else on my team, a disabled Army veteran, also a new hire, hired in November of 2024. She had already received her termination notice a day prior, and her and I were both in kind of like the same category, and so I just assumed it was a matter of time that I would receive the same notice. But I hadn't received a termination letter, but then about midday or so on Friday, I got a call from my team lead saying, hey, I don't have a letter for you yet, but you're on the list. This is your last day. You know, this is kind of it. And the IRS is going to overnight a letter to you, giving you details and, you know, an official termination notice.
You mentioned you kind of had a sense this was coming, but how did you feel in that moment when you found out?
It was a combination of relief and disappointment, honestly, because when I first came on board, I kind of felt like I had gotten my government ID, I'd got my government laptop, I had access to the building, you know, right before the door slammed behind me. There was someone else who was supposed to onboard with me who had surgery, and so her onboarding was pushed back and her offer letter was actually rescinded, so she didn't even get to start. And so I thought, okay, I made it just in time, but there was always this feeling of like, okay, I made it just in time, but I probably won't be here for long.
Why relief, though? I'm kind of struggling with that. I want to understand.
Sure. I mean, I think every day that went by, I was, you know, watching the clock and 5 p.m. would roll around and I thought, okay, I still have a job. But then there was this sense of like dread and doom, like, okay, was that my last day? What's going to happen tomorrow? There was just really no security or reassurances that this was going to last for very long. And so the sooner it could just get over with, I could just move on and start applying for other opportunities or, you know, just look for something else, because staying in a job that you know is likely temporary is just not a great feeling.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you go into the federal government assuming that's a rather secure long-term career?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's part of the appeal, and that's one of the ways that the federal government compensates for lower pay compared to the private sector is by offering stability and security. And so, this was a job that had essentially built-in promotions at the 1-year mark for the next 2 years, and what's equivalent to like tenure for a college professor. After 2 years, assuming performance, everything's going well, you're going to be retained indefinitely. So yes, people go into the federal government expecting long-term stability.
What does this mean for you and your family right now?
In the short term, it means instability and uncertainty. Life doesn't stop when you lose your job. You still have a mortgage, you still have obligations. And really, rather than being able to put all of your focus and energy towards your job, you have a new job, and that's looking for opportunity. So you just have to redirect all of your energy towards, being persistent and finding something new.
So a group of people from your former employer would let go. Are you in touch with them? What were you saying to each other? Do you still hear from them?
I've been in touch with several of them, mainly my team lead and my manager, who are also veterans actually, but they've been with the IRS so long that they have more protection than I do. And they're just as disappointed and dismayed as I am. So I have been in touch with them. I immediately reached out to my coworker who was let go on Thursday. When I was let go on Friday, I reached out to her, just kind of say, hey, it's definitely not personal, just so you know it. It wasn't just you. I was let go as well. And just kind of asking her, is there anything you need? Is there anything I can do to help? And there are even informal groups on different social media channels where people have sort of gotten together and, if nothing else, just to provide that sense of community, but also to relay resources and sort of say, hey, this here's something that worked for me, or here's someone I talked to, or here's something you could look into if you're interested in class action, lawsuits. There's different organizations that are trying to represent people who don't have appeal rights and the more like traditional methods of appealing this decision.
Under your understanding, what does a probationary period for a federal employee mean?
Yeah, so when it comes to probationary federal employees, I think there's two definitions out there right now. There's the one that's accurate, and then there's the myth that exists, publicly for people who haven't worked in government. And so, probationary employees, it's not what people think it is. It's a term that has a negative connotation that's inherited or borrowed from the justice system, where if you're guilty of a crime, you're sort of kept on a short leash because you've done something wrong and you need to be monitored. And that's not the case here at all. We are on probation simply because we're new to a particular agency, or we've had a break in civil service. Like in my case, I worked for NASA previously. 2 years went by where I was a government contractor before I was hired into my next federal job. Or maybe you've been promoted. So there's any number of things that can mean you're on probation. And so for 1 to 2 years, that temporarily affects your right to appeal your own firing. And that's really what they went for in this first wave of mass firings, was the low-hanging fruit, people who are most vulnerable and who cannot easily protest their own firing.
So to be clear, you were at the IRS in Orlando for 5 weeks, but you were in no way whatsoever new as a government employee.
No, not at all. So I had almost 4 years of civil service with NASA. Then I was a government contractor for almost 2 years. And so this was just a new federal job or a new agency for me. But if you combine military, federal service, government contractor, I've been doing this for almost 10 years.
So the day after you were let go, you receive a written letter from the IRS. Can you read me the part that explains a justification about why you were let go?
Sure. So on the last paragraph of the first page, it reads, quote, taking into account your performance and in light of current mission needs, the agency finds that your continued employment at the agency is not in the public interest.
What went through your head when you read that?
Well, first of all, it's just not accurate. I haven't even been at the IRS long enough to receive a performance review. And so there's no negative performance review to justify this firing. And even if they wanted to go back to the last time I was in civil service at NASA, all of my performance reviews explicitly states meets or exceeds expectations. And so there's no real justification regarding performance with this firing.
As I'm talking to you, I'm wondering about just how you're doing. For a lot of people right now, the cost of living is just extraordinary. Are you concerned right now about making ends meet?
Yes, I am. I mean, I am concerned about making ends meet. I'm okay for right now, and I'm confident something will come up here in the near future. But I'm more concerned about others who maybe aren't in the same situation than I am. You know, some veterans have used their savings to relocate and move to a different part of the country to take a federal job, and now they don't have enough money to move back where they came from or really start over. And so there's a lot of people who were really counting on the stability and like longevity of this federal job and are really in a pinch now. And I'm fortunate in that I've been here in Orlando. I'm pretty well established. I've been here for 15 years. I'm confident something will work out for me. So I do have near-term concerns, but there are people who are in much more dire and urgent situations than I am.
You served as a U.S. Marine in the Iraq War. You're a disabled veteran. You've served this country. What do you say to the DOGE team and the administration just cutting all these federal positions right now?
Yeah, so I've given that a lot of thought. And, you know, I think the message being sent to veterans right now is thank you for your service, but it wasn't enough. The country's in debt, and we also need you to give up your job. And I think that's really the wrong message to veterans who have already sacrificed a lot, to tell them that they also need to give up their job.
What is your response to the narrative that we hear, that DOGE is cutting waste, that the federal employees being cut are lazy, they're corrupt, they don't go to work?
I mean, it's just not true. Having worked for the federal government for several years now, those of us on the inside will absolutely agree with you that there are inefficiencies. There are ways that we can streamline our processes. There are potentially people who are eligible for retirement who are just hanging around, and maybe an incentive should be given for them to just go ahead and take the retirement. But especially new hires, people who have worked really hard to get into the federal government, to terminate them is really a mistake. Members of Congress have given presentations on the House floor, and they've shown, you know, even if you were to get rid of half of all federal workers, that would be equivalent to the interest that we pay on the national debt for 1 month. So it really doesn't address the problem. You know, federal workers and their salaries are not the reason that the country is facing a debt crisis or a budget deficit. And so even if we were to blame, this isn't the right way to go about it. But the fact is, this isn't really the source of the problem.
Something you told me, Doug, really resonated with me. You told me that this isn't about being impacted by the cuts. This is about being directly harmed by the cuts. What did you mean by that when you said that to me?
Yeah, so I think there's a tendency to use broad, impersonal language in describing the justification and the consequences of these recent actions, and to say, you know, 10,000 or 20,000 workers have been impacted. And what we're really saying is that these workers have been dismissed, have been fired, have lost their source of income, have been told that their job and their employment with the federal government is no longer in the public interest. And I think a lot of people take that personally because they feel a sense of responsibility and a sense of pride in the work that they're doing. And so it has a practical consequence, but also a personal consequence. And so not only does it make it more difficult to meet all of your financial obligations in the near term, but also it sends a message that we're not really wanted, we're not really valued, and really that we are part of the problem and not part of the solution. And I think that's absolutely the wrong message.
Earlier, I asked you how you were feeling in the moment when you found out that you were being let go. It's been a couple of weeks that you've been sitting with this. Has anything changed?
I think so. I mean, initially, there's a sense of relief just to go ahead and get it over with. I mean, imagine if you were driving down the road and your brakes failed and you saw an obstacle up ahead, but, you know, it was really being drawn out. I mean, you would kind of feel a sense of relief once you finally made impact and like, okay, this thing that I've been dreading, that's been up ahead, it's finally happened. And now I can move on to the next step and damage control, or how I react and how I respond. And so waiting for the unknown is not a great feeling. I am still glad, honestly, that it's already happened versus waiting for it to happen. But now that I've had some time to sit with it, it just seems even more like an injustice and reckless, the kind of the way that this has happened. And I just think there's got to be a better way to do this. But then there's still an opportunity to tell people what's really happening, because this story will eventually go away. Public interest will, wean off. And so it's important right now, while people are still interested in paying attention, to let them know how people like me are being impacted.
What's the biggest misconception people have about what is happening with the cuts to the federal workforce?
Yes, so there's been a lot of talk about merit, and I think there's this perception from the public, we're finally heading in the right direction. We're finally doing something that's long overdue. And I'm not convinced that that is the case. 30% of the federal workforce are veterans. And, veterans, former members of the military, are familiar with and embrace the idea of merit-based promotion and merit-based systems. We've all stood in front of promotion boards or been nominated for meritorious promotion. So it's really a slap in the face to send us these letters saying, quote, based on your performance, your employment in the federal government is no longer in the public interest, when really our firing had nothing to do with merit. I hadn't even been at the IRS long enough to have a performance review. And so, this idea that we are heading in the right direction, that we're finally, taking into account and making merit a top priority, is simply not the case. People imagine that all these federal workers being let go are entrenched career DC bureaucrats, and that's simply not the case. Majority of federal workers live outside of DC. By nature and by law, federal workers are apolitical. There's something called the Hatch Act. It's a federal law. It limits political activity and prohibits all partisan political activity for federal workers. And so you won't even see campaign stickers on the bumpers of our cars, and we're certainly not at work talking about which candidates we support during an election year. We're, by nature and by law, apolitical.
That was Orlando-based Marine veteran Doug Jackson talking about being fired from the federal government as a probationary employee. And we want to hear from you. If you're a federal employee, if you were let go, or if you see these cuts as a positive, we want to hear the voices of our Central Florida community. You can send us an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Peyton Perry is 17 years into her career at FCC Coleman. The federal correctional complex that houses inmates near Wildwood is one of Sumter County's largest employers. Perry is a contract specialist there and member of the American Federation of Government Employees Local 506 Union, who travels to D.C. as a legislative coordinator to meet with lawmakers. She joined Engage to talk about her concerns that federal DOGE job cuts could create an unsafe atmosphere for inmates, employees, and the surrounding Central Florida community. Perry began our conversation by describing the email she received last week requiring federal employees to justify their jobs.
We received 2 emails asking us to give a 5-bullet kind of information about what we did last week while we were working. And so last week when we got that email, we were given guidance from the Bureau of Prisons that our jobs having to do with law enforcement, federal law enforcement, not to answer those questions because any information we give out could jeopardize the security here at the prison, and they don't want any information that could hurt our daily operations here. Now, this week, when we got that email, we were told to hang on for a second, let's get some guidance, and we did get the guidance. So the people who have direct interactions with the inmates every single day were told to give just the very basic, my job is in security, and I don't want to violate any kind of security protocol by giving out the wrong information. And that was what our agency told them to do. And the people who were not basically hands-on with the inmates were directed to do the 5 bullet points.
You would be one of those people?
I was one of the people that did the 5 bullet points, yes.
Where did the letter come from, as in who signed it?
Well, it comes from the Office of Personnel Management. It wasn't a letter, it was just an email from HR at the Office of Personnel Management, OPM.
So what's going through your head? Like, how do you respond to it?
Well, all of our employees out here are obviously keeping a close eye on the news and watching all of the reports that come out. And so we've all heard the reports that say that they're looking to basically make sure that we're able to respond to an email. We have 2 neurons and a beating heart, I think is the way Elon Musk explained it. And so obviously we all want to make sure that they know that we're here and that we are working very hard to do the jobs that they have trusted us to do. And then the other hand of that is, where are our jobs going? What's going to happen to us in the future? What is the future of the BOP? So we are all a little bit nervous about what they're going to do with us.
How do you pick the bullet points? Like, what did you say?
Well, I basically, in and out every day, I negotiate pricing for the government and I get the best value for contracts on the government. So I picked out, obviously I did more than 5 things last week. I picked out a lot of the things that I did. And so while I did 5 bullet points, I condensed a lot of things into 1 bullet point. So they could see that I'm not just doing 5 things. I'm doing a lot of things, but I just responded the best I could to what I actually do every day, what my position does every day.
Just curious, did anyone respond when you sent in that email?
No. We were told that now we'll have to do that every Monday. And we are to send it to the Office of Personnel Management and copy our supervisors.
I'm sorry, I just want to clarify, make sure I understood. Did you say that you have to do that every Monday?
Yes.
How does that make you feel hearing that?
Well, it makes me a little bit nervous because my supervisor obviously is the one that gets paid to track my tasks and what I'm doing, and if I'm performing up to the standards that the government expects of me, and basically gives me feedback as to whether or not I'm doing exactly what I need to be doing. And so now I give that information to my supervisor, who's supposed to be looking at it, and then I give that information to the Office of Personnel Management, which is just a large, basically HR department over the entire federal government. And you just wonder, what will the Office of Personnel Management, I mean, what is it for? Obviously, I have a heartbeat and 2 neurons, so I can tell you what I've done, and I'm happy to tell you what I've done, but what are we using it for? And if I respond to you and I'm able to give you a well-written email that tells you what I've done, and you can tell that I'm a live person, having to do it every week obviously negates the fact that you're looking for a heartbeat and 2 neurons, because you've already gotten that answer once. So what is it that you're looking for?
I know that you just traveled to DC in February, and you were telling me you go there to present issues to lawmakers to keep them informed about what's going on with the department, the issues that you all are dealing with. Did you hear anything about potential cuts to the federal penal system and Coleman specifically?
Yes, we have not heard anything on exactly what they're going to do. But what we did find was that the Budget Committee has made a lot of recommendations to the Ways and Means Committee for certain things that they can cut and do different ways so that they can balance the budget, make the budget work for everybody. But a couple of those things will affect the federal government on a wide scale, and a couple of them will affect federal law enforcement officers. It was very interesting because one of the things that they are looking at and possibly going to vote on is changing our healthcare system. You're part of the federal government's healthcare, their health insurance. Well, they're looking at making that possibly go away and then giving every individual employee a healthcare voucher. So obviously, if you do that, you're taking away our ability to compete in the healthcare coverage market as a large group, which gets bigger discounts. Now we're going into the market as individuals trying to get our healthcare coverage. And that's obviously going to have a deep impact on our community here, our staff here at FCC Coleman and across the government. But when we got to Washington, D.C. and started talking with the staff there in the congresswomen's offices, those staff are on the same health insurance plan that we are, and they had not heard about it yet. So they were like, oh my goodness, what? And so we were able to show them, okay, this is one of the recommendations. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it is one of the things that they have said could help get the budget back where it needs to be. And another thing that they're looking at is if you work in federal law enforcement, here at the Bureau of Prisons, they require you to retire at age 57. So you can't draw your Social Security until you're 62. So one of the benefits of working here as a federal law enforcement officer is that you get a Social Security stipend. It's not your entire Social Security benefit, but you get a little bit of it between the time you retire at 57 until you can draw your full retirement benefit at 62. And that obviously helps with some of the financial needs that our retirees are facing. If you take that, they're looking at possibly voting to take that away. So that removes, a large gap of money between the time that we retire and the time that we can draw our Social Security benefits. So that's another thing that they're looking at. So that would affect a lot of federal law enforcement officers, maybe not just the BOP, but across the government. So those are the types of things that we were talking to them about, trying to encourage them to maybe look at other options, not take those specific things away, because it would be detrimental to the Bureau of Prisons staff across the nation.
Couple of follow-ups for you. First, what is your response to those people who are saying that these changes will help balance the budget and are good for the federal government overall?
My response is that that's probably a solid argument that they're making, that it will help balance the budget, and it would probably, anything the government can do to save money is going to be to benefit of the government. And I pay taxes, so obviously I want the government to be a good steward of my tax dollars. However, it's kind of like when you go back to the general public, and when we were back in the days of Obamacare, and a lot of people not being able to afford their health care insurance and having to go through the Obamacare plan, and how much struggle that was for the families who were just, getting started in those. We're going to face the same kind of thing here. We're going to go from one insurance company that we're used to using. I've had the same insurance company for 17 years. If that benefit goes away and you send me to a voucher system, obviously I would think it's reasonable to deduct that that's going to cost me more money to go out and find my health insurance, which is going to affect my family's bottom line as in the financial world. So I can see how it benefits the government, but I can also see what kind of negative impact it will have on the actual people who are here working.
And you've said in the past that FCC Coleman is understaffed. Could you talk about how understaffing and the impact of these potential changes, how could that impact the inmates there, the employees, just the conditions overall?
Yes. So the Bureau of Prisons is facing a terrible situation of not having enough staff across the nation. So FCC Coleman is not the only prison that's having it, but we are one of the ones that are having a huge problem attracting people to come to work here. And what that does is it creates a gap for people who are working, not being able to have anyone to come in and relieve them, to take over their post for the beginning of the next shift. So what you find is a lot of our staff will work what the Bureau of Prisons calls a mandatory overtime, and they're doing it 2 or 3 times a week. So let's say you come to work on Monday and your shift is from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. I get here at 8, and at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, my lieutenant calls me and says, hey, I don't have anybody to cover your shift or relieve you. I need you to stay another 8 hours. So now I'm going to stay here from 4 to midnight. So now effectively I will have been here from 8 a.m. till midnight. That's with 1 hour's notice. So if I have children and they're in school, or if they're at daycare, I've got to make some arrangements. If I had an appointment after work, I'm going to have to cancel that, because the word mandatory is exactly what it says. You may not say no. If you refuse your mandatory, then you stand to receive some type of discipline for refusing the mandate. And that's happening to our staff here 3-4 times a week, depending on what institution you're working in. FCC Coleman is the largest federal prison in the United States. We have 5 institutions here on our complex, 2 high securities, a medium, a low, and a camp. So we have every security level that there is. And, when you've got people working double shifts 3 or 4 times a week, they get tired, they get complacent. it puts them in a position where they can possibly suffer from inmate targeting or inmate on staff assaults. It's a dangerous situation to be in. And obviously, if they make these cuts, it would be even harder to draw people to work here, which means our staffing will get even worse, which increases our danger level.
What is the biggest misconception people have about what is happening right now with all the cuts to federal government employees?
I think the biggest misconception is the idea that people think that no one in federal government works. That's obviously not true, because to some degree our federal government works. The Veterans Affairs, the veterans get their benefits, and they have people to supply services. Here at the Bureau of Prisons, the prisoners are staying inside our fences and keeping the community safe from them while we keep them during their sentence. So the misconception is the bad reputation from the bad actors that have been publicized for years and years and years. I come to work every day at 6. I go home every day at 4. I work that entire time that I'm here. I'm doing my job. I'm helping other people do their jobs. I'm working. And so when they look at government employees and they say, "Oh, you're a government employee, you don't even that's not even a real job," you kind of laugh with them, because you know that that's the rumor that's out there. But our men and women here are facing inmates that don't have anything to lose if they decided they wanted to attack you. You're facing assaults and dangerous situations and dangerous chemicals. We have a terrible, terrible fentanyl problem coming in through our mail, because people on the outside can manipulate mail and put the fentanyl on it. We have staff coming in contact with that every day and having medical reactions to it that are dangerous. We had a gentleman out in California just recently pass away from a fentanyl exposure. So, when you talk about no one in the federal government is working, these men and women in the Federal Bureau of Prisons are working. I'm not going to tell you that we don't have bad actors, but every company has bad actors. Every agency, every small business out on the street, everybody faces that. But don't take that aspect and apply it to every single person you've ever met that works for the federal government, because it's just not accurate.
Peyton Perry is an FCC Coleman employee. And finally, sometimes it's necessary to balance out the important but stressful news with something positive. That's why we try to end every episode of Engage on an upbeat note. We're going to take just a couple minutes now to tell you about a Central Floridian striving to make his community a better place. Deltona resident Gio Acosta had a tough time finding a job and re-entering the workforce after serving in the military.
When I got back, I could not find a job. I did not have a car when I got back. I was borrowing my mom's car to go to interviews and go to work whenever she was working herself. So that in itself was very stressful. It was during the pandemic, so it was extremely hard for me to get a job. Everybody was so kind of hesitant in getting applicants. I applied at Walmart. I applied at Home Depot. I applied at a lot of places in Orange City, because that was where I was around. I ended up going back to my high school job at Wendy's. They hired me back, and that's when I got in contact with my family member that worked at Goodwill. They told me about it. I applied. Not even 2 weeks later, they called me for an interview.
Identifying with the mission of helping others, Gio says he rose from a part-time cashier to being a key holder at the downtown Sanford location in just 4 years.
I am excited for what's to come. My goal is to hopefully be a store manager at a store nearby where I'm at. It's good to go into work today. Go into work in general, and to see that what I'm doing has an impact in those that work with me, those that work around me, the community that I have. I have a great relationship with the customers that I have in Sanford. And, I'm just excited to see what more we can do for the company, what more I can do to help those that my employees are with me that wants to move up and that they're struggling with themselves, and to give them the guidance that they need, like I got the guidance whenever I was in their position.
Gio was recognized as the Goodwill Achiever of the Year for his work uplifting others in Central Florida. That's all for today's edition of Engage. All of our shows are available on demand at cfpublic.org. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for joining us. All Things Considered is coming up following NPR News.